Well, good morning and welcome to Bible Drills, where we take a moment of time in God's timeless Word. We're going to pick up the story of Jesus in Mark chapter 1 and start at verse 40. A man with leprosy came to him and begged him on his knees, "If you are willing, you can make me clean." Jesus showed compassion, and he reached out his hand and touched the man. "I am willing," he said. "Be clean." Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cleansed. Jesus sent him away at once with a strong warning. "See to it that you don't tell anyone, but go and show yourself to the priest and offer the sacrifices that Moses commanded for your cleansing as a testimony to them." Instead, he went out and began to talk freely, spreading the news. As a result, Jesus could no longer enter a town openly, but stayed outside in lonely places. Yet, the people still came to him from everywhere. What an interesting story. There's so many dynamics at play in this, but I think just to capsulize some of the key ones. One is, of course, that understanding what leprosy was in the culture. The person who was a leper was expected to stay away from society, not allowed to enter any of the church meetings, the synagogue meetings, the temple meetings, the gatherings of any kind. They had to live outside of town. They had to live in their own colonies. Mostly they would create their own leper colonies. Now, these lepers were not necessarily as leprosy as we think it was. It could have been, but it also a broad term, which includes any skin irritations, any rashes, anything like that that was public. People were not allowed to be near them. And so what you have here is you have a very sort of outcast, marginalized man coming to Jesus very bravely, I would say, coming to him and asking if he would be able to make him clean. And that word clean is different than heal me. Cleansing was the word that was used to describe what the priest would pronounce over someone whose leprosy was no longer considered a threat or contagious, or they had been healed. And so the person would go to the temple. You couldn't just show up in your family because nobody would be near you. They would run from you. In fact, there are even stories of rocks being thrown to keep them at a distance. So you couldn't just show up in your community and expect people to gather around you. "Oh, this is wonderful." No, they would continue to run away from you and not believe you. And so you needed the absolute cleansing declaration, a certificate of cleansing from a priest. And you would have to make an offering as was accepted according to the book of Leviticus. And so that's what this man was being asked by Jesus to do. And it was not just because Jesus was trying to, put a few obstacles in the way just to see if he really meant business. No, it was because Jesus wanted him to follow the law. He wanted him to be accepted and be seen as cleansed. And he also knew that it would go down on the record that he was in support of the temple. He was not an adversary to the temple or to the temple leaders or to the laws. And so that's the one thing that I think is really important. Of course, this man didn't obey Jesus. He took off telling everybody he saw, which, okay, you can give him some grace. The man was healed and of leprosy, and he was gone from an outcast to an insider suddenly. So I could see that it would be hard for him to do that, but he still completely disobeyed Jesus' recommendation. And as a result of that, as a result of his disobedience, Jesus could no longer follow the plan that he'd laid out. Remember, he went away in prayer and the disciples came to find him and he said, "Well, no, we need to go to other towns." So Jesus' plan was to go from town to town to town. But because of this man's words, the word quickly spread and he couldn't even enter into a town. And so he ended up having to minister in what's called lonely places. And I kind of like that. I think there's something there for us in our lonely places, in the places where we are feeling most vulnerable, the places where we are feeling most separated. Maybe we feel a little bit like nobody understands world like we do, or maybe nobody's had the experiences that I've had, even though that may not be true and probably isn't. It's how we feel. And it's there that Jesus is. He's already there. Isn't that interesting? And when you feel those things, or when you feel out of sorts, or you feel like you're an outcast, or you feel like you're marginalized, these are the things that Jesus is basically saying, I'm here, I'm in the lonely place, come to me. And it says here that many people still came out from everywhere to see him. So the fact that he wasn't in the town, yes, it was a disruption to the plan that he created, but that also meant that the people just kept flooding to him and flocking to be near him, to hear his teaching and to be cleansed. And the last point is that Jesus reached out and touched this man. I always find that fascinating. According to the laws, the ceremonial cleansing laws, he wasn't allowed to touch that man. And yet Jesus did anyway. And I can only imagine the feelings that are kind of woven through this in the man's heart, who had been marginalized, outcast, thrown outside. He had to live in a separate colony, away from town, away from family, away from everything that we would consider important, isolated. And yet Jesus reached out his hand and touched him. Imagine what was in that touch. That sense of warmth, that sense of comfort, the compassion that Jesus showed. And that also is something for us to remember, that he is a compassionate God, that he wants us to come to him. He wants us to be brave, come to him for healing, come to him for our needs, realize that he's already in the places that are lonely and hard, and he's there, and he wants us to come to him. He's a tender God, and he's willing to come and meet us at our need and touch us in those places where we are most vulnerable and maybe uncomfortable, but he wants to heal. He wants to reach out and touch us. So this is the Jesus that is portrayed in the book of Mark. And I just hope and pray that you have been encouraged today to look for Jesus in the lonely places. He will reach out to you, and you can come to him in faith.